Hey guys, Youssef here, the other half of the Experiments in Dialogue duo. Just as a pre-show note, here's a rundown of what we'll be talking about today. In general, in the wake of the last podcast, the response was positive. We were happy to find that so many of you enjoyed the podcast episode and found it a breath of fresh air from the otherwise outraged narratives being conveyed through the media. The discussion we had, though it was very enjoyable, did not allow us, by virtue of its specificity, to delve deeper into the philosophical ideas we usually discuss. This time around, however, we hope to deliver you some deeper insight into the workings of our own private conversations. In general, the episode you're about to hear is more similar to the kinds of conversations Ahmed and I tend to have in our own time. And so, while we do attempt to make all concepts clearer than we otherwise would, we do move from topic to topic at a fairly quick pace. If you want us to elaborate on any of it, please do get in contact with us through our Facebook page, by email, or become our patron on Patreon. Finally, if you like what we're doing, remember to like our podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And please do subscribe on your favorite podcasting service to get regular updates about what we're up to. Without further ado, we bring you the third experiment in dialogue. Hello everyone, welcome to the Experiments in Dialogue podcast. And hey Ahmed, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you, man?
I'm fine. Things are going by well.
Yeah, so we're starting this really to go over just what we were talking about maybe before the podcast, about all the response that we got last time around when we released our podcast episode with Mofe. And I really wanted us to just maybe talk about the fact that the response has been, first of all, just amazing and very humbling. But second of all, has been very interesting because people have found themselves wanting us to talk more specifically about certain subjects, certain concepts that we brought up. And in particular, one concept I think you and I both have received some expression of interest in. And that's the concept of the loneliness of subjectivity. Mm-hmm. Now, in general, when we brought that up, I really was not expecting you to comment and bring me in just to make that point. I had it in the back recess of my mind, but I didn't expect us to be able to make such a smooth transition from the specific events to the abstract. And so, I mean, what exactly caused you or drove you to bring that in? Do you remember?
It's mostly because usually when people are confronted by their own loneliness of subjectivity, and we'll touch on that soon, we'll touch on what exactly we mean by that.
Right.
People usually, when they're confronted by their own loneliness, they usually, the attraction to substitute your own loneliness of subjectivity with bad ideas, bad institutions, ones that promote collective guilt or groupthink. So we were discussing the Black Lives Matter movement, and I think that's a symptom of the movement. It would be the reason the movement is so attractive would be in part because people are usually also confronted by their own loneliness of subjectivity, and it gives them an answer. It tells them, here's something you can relate to. Here's something that you can lose your individuality and be a part of.
Yeah. I mean, it was very interesting to me because after that talk, for us, it's very normal to speak in these terms, and because it's so familiar to us. At some point, I was wondering if this was kind of a unique concept to us, or if there were some other similar ideas amongst other philosophers in the past. And I came across the concept of existential isolation. And the concept of existential isolation is kind of similar to the loneliness of subjectivity, although it doesn't quite capture it, right? So existential isolation is this realization that you are alone in your experience and therefore alone in your responsibility for what kind of life you end up having, right? And that's a bit different. I don't think that is exactly what we are trying to get at when we were talking about the loneliness of subjectivity. And I tried to Google it really to see if there was if we were actually plagiarizing someone unknowingly, but I found a lot of results about the subjectivity of loneliness, but not the loneliness of subjectivity. And it seems like that's pretty much our term, if anything can be called that, right?
Yeah. I am very interested about what was it called? Existential loneliness?
Isolation.
Existential isolation. I mean, one important conclusion you draw out of the loneliness of subjectivity would be that you are alone in your responsibility. That is a part of it that would be good to touch on later on.
Yeah. I think it would be very relevant, especially for one of our upcoming episodes. Just to flag for some people who might be interested, we were hoping to have a discussion about psychoanalysis and evolutionary psychology with, really a person who's far more knowledgeable about it than at least I am. And I'm looking forward to that because it'll be really, hopefully, educational on the part of the person teaching us or teaching me. But yeah, we
can also say that we're trying to periodically release this podcast every week or so, trying to make it more frequent. And so we like Ahmed just said, we have some podcasts planned and some podcast ideas as well.
Yeah.
So you can
look forward to those.
Predict,
I guess.
You'll like things are coming.
Yeah. And the ones that we'll be covering more, I think, alone will be kind of these less formal, more casual kind of conversations about maybe concepts in our own worldviews, in our own frequent, not worldviews, but not necessarily worldviews, but even in our own frequent usage with each other, which people might be interested in leveraging. I think some of the things that we've benefited from is the ability to name things that we commonly don't have language for, and things that are actually difficult usually to speak to people about. But once you have the term, once you've defined it sufficiently precisely for conversational terms, it really can be very useful, right? So, I mean, now I think that we've thrown this term, the loneliness of subjectivity, and, Mofe on the podcast even reiterated it several times, which is much to our benefit, really. Thank you, Mofe.
And also to just define our terms in case someone is following this podcast, we'll usually be reiterating the terms. We'll usually be saying them a lot. So a good sufficient understanding would be also a good tap into how we think and our worldviews.
Yeah, and I think it'll help people even to argue with us. I mean, if you don't agree with many of the things that we have to say, which is possible, right, and possibly even probable, you might want to be able to still leverage the concepts that we are leveraging to show us why we're wrong. And I think that the term loneliness of subjectivity was actually pointed out by one of my friends in an attempt to argue against me as well. So that was very interesting. I found that very interesting. Now, I think let's just go back and kind of define the loneliness of subjectivity again, just to start. And, in the context of Black Lives Matter, in the context of these group ideologies that are emerging, in the context of these institutions that are currently kind of becoming the basis for how people construct meaning, how people construct their identities within the world. It's no longer about the individual as much. I think it's a return to this tribalism. And it's driven, as you said, by an emptiness that is left by the discovery that you are lonely in your subjectivity, right? That subjectivity is fundamentally lonesome. And just maybe give us the definition that you possibly even gave to Mofe, or maybe one that's slightly different, whatever you'd like. I think that would be useful.
If I remember correctly, I start with this statement, which is that in a very real sense, everyone is the center of their own universe. And what I mean by that is you at some point come to confront that. I think there's an unconscious part of it that is always functioning, but you come to the conscious understanding that you are very alone in your experience. And there are many layers to that, right? Because one layer is, well, nobody has your exact same biology. and no one was born in the exact same environment, to the exact same parents, in the exact same household. And even taking it a bit further, no one has been through the small things you've been through.
Right.
No one has, if you've ever been in love, the way you've met your partner and what drink you were drinking and how they were dressed and what time of day and how you were feeling and how was your overall well-being. All these things are just it's impossible for someone to replicate your experience, your subjective experience. So in some sense, one side of the coin is, well, that does make you an individual, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
But on the other side is that you're very lonely in that nobody can truly dissolve of their individual to feel yours. So that would be what I mean when I say the loneliness of subjectivity.
Yeah, and I think let's take it even further to say that just because people recently have found themselves more and more isolated from communal sense, right? Especially if we're talking, even if we're talking in Egypt, right? People are feeling more and more isolated from communal sense-making apparatuses, or apparata. And then what you have coming in as a result of that is this feeling of, yeah, sure, I'm unique, I'm an individual, but what good is that, right? Because all the things that I usually would have benefited from, right? Community, culture, society, family, whatever group you have usually benefited from or identify with, people are feeling less and less identified with. And there are several factors playing into this, right? One might even argue that capitalism has driven parts of that, right? The commodification of life, of the development of a more individualistic society where people seek out things for their own purposes rather than for the purpose of some greater good in which they feel embedded, right? This feels as though it's somehow making us less and less in touch with group identity. And
to touch on the capitalism part, it's also the market's proclivity to give you expedient alternatives to rather supposed embedded human institutions.
Absolutely.
Such as the family, childbearing, child raising. There are a lot of things that are just substituted by the market at a much lower price, which makes them much more attractive, much more efficient to some people,
but also at a lower quality, right? Usually, because it's at a lower quality for, at least for you especially, right? It seems that people think that once you substitute these meaningful these things that are supposed to be meaningful sources of life, and actually the reason why many people lived historically, once you substitute them, you've just gotten rid of one sort of distraction. And now you can focus on what is really important, right? Our perception of what matters, our perception of what is truly the purpose of our lives is really changed with the increased individuality that markets have brought. Now, the markets have brought many good things, and you and I are always great advocates for the good things markets bring, right? They bring all the commodities and all the opportunities that we are most interested in and love, right? They've allowed people to get rich off of simply making YouTube videos, right? If that is not a win for creativity, I don't know what is, right? On the other hand, they've also disenfranchised people, right? They've made them feel like the whole purpose for their existence should be or is to serve this machine, this manufacturing machine, rather than, for example, to pursue the growth of a family, right? And the development of a family and the healthy development of their children, right? And I think one thing that people miss out on is this critique of markets should not be one that is necessarily damning. You don't have to believe that markets are absolutely bad to acknowledge these flaws, right? To acknowledge that the loneliness of subjectivity has been brought forth more and more with the emergence of markets, right? It's come to the fore. It used to be something perhaps that you would ponder in your weakest moments, right? When you were less surrounded by people you care about and who care about you. But now it's become potentially something that even if you don't have a term for, even if you're not completely conscious of experiencing, you are aware of it, right? You are subjectively aware of it. You're experiencing it every moment. And how that's affected the way we interact is it's made us wish to do away with this individuality that we have completely and return to something like tribalism, right? It's this idea, it's this hope that, sure, maybe no one can understand me, but surely at least the people who look exactly like me understand me.
Well,
it's so hopeful, right?
I think that's, absolutely. I think it's, I mean, a good analysis of this would be this kind of ever-going, like, dialectic loop, in the sense that, well, with the emergence of markets and, industrialization, since the beginning of the 20th century, this has brought people closer. This has brought people of different cultures closer. And it wasn't easy for people to sustain different cultural values around each other. So it has been gradually breaking down. And now people are trying to build anew. That's the meaning crisis. Like this term coined, it's called fragilization.
Yeah.
I'm not sure who coined it. I can look at that later. But the main idea is people used to have such cultural bonds because they weren't also they didn't see other cultures. They didn't have to interact with people from different culture and with other cultural values. So now that we need to sustain these cultural differences, and that is most evident in Europe and in the West, given the rather wide cultural diversity in comparison to the other world, to other countries. And you look at that, and now they couldn't sustain the differences, right? And then they tried the multicultural model, which is to let's first focus on what makes us different than what makes us the same. And you see, let's focus on what makes us different than what makes us the same is such a fractal truth, what we call it. It could be applied to many different levels of
analysis.
Of analysis. Exactly, it could be like on the individual level, on the social level, on the cultural level. So people tried to sustain these differences and failed, and it's been breaking down, right? And the market has been acting in this manner in which it always acts, because it's it's not really directed. Its trajectory is just rather
largely unconscious and emergent.
Yeah,
right? It's
largely
not necessarily
blind, right? Evolutionary.
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, people can game markets, but overall, in general, markets will tend towards whatever is being selected for at the moment, and yeah, they are very evolutionary in that sense. They actually follow what we dub, or what actually several evolutionary thinkers dub the evolutionary algorithm. Right?
Yeah.
They have selection built into them in the form of consumers buying from certain firms and not buying from other firms. They have some form of random mutation. That is, they have some form of creation, right? There's some creative force behind them, which is the analog of random mutation, which is basically the emergence of different products of different sizes, different colors, especially in markets that are working well. You have large amounts of varied products, and those varied products act as the object on which the whole evolutionary algorithm operates, right? The whole selection that comes from consumers buying the ones that are attractive, the goods that are attractive, and those goods, as a result, allowing firms to survive or die, and surviving themselves or not. And as time goes by, right, what is selected for is whatever the consumers are most wanting, or whatever is best at exploiting and competing for the resources of the consumers, whether that be resources in terms of attention or resources in terms of money, or both, usually, right? And so it is, in a sense, evolutionary, right? And in a sense, it is a selective process. And this is where people kind of try to imbue the markets with an ideology in a way that seems to be kind of missing the point, right? The markets are not per se directed by some top-down mechanism. I mean, that's exactly the opposite of what a market is intended to be. Now, at some points, it can be gamed, right? You can have monopolies, you can have market failures, and any person aware of basic economics will tell you market failures occur. But in general, when markets are operating, they serve as a corrective for the top-down, centralized command economy style economics that would otherwise emerge, right? The desire to control everything top-down and basically say or dictate from above what should be produced, how it should be produced, how much of it should be produced, and by whom. These are things that are not things that we humans with our limited capacities for conceptualizing of complex systems can do very well. And so we've offshored this in a way to the markets, right? We've told markets to do it because markets are just so simple and so convenient for it. Again, this isn't to take away from any of the negative effects of markets. This is just to say that it is a process, right? And it is a powerful process that's brought us a lot of good, and when it works well, works really well. But when it works badly, can really exploit us, right?
That's absolutely correct. So to go back to the point of like, now that we are confronted by different cultures, and now that you are almost anywhere confronted by all cultures, right? You have the internet, you have social media, and it's not as easy anymore to live in like an echo chamber, which was necessarily the status quo going back in time.
Right.
So
in some ways, just to stop here, in some ways it is a bit harder. It is a bit harder, but in other ways it's become really easy, right? The recoiling back into the internet has allowed that, right? But in real life, it's really hard to go out into the streets without being just hit with the reality that people with other views, with other ways of being exist, with other looks even, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like the way they speak on the phone, the way they, absolutely. The way they say hi and bye, and the way they shake hands, and the way they might kiss you 3 times, but other people kiss you 2 times, all of these things, absolutely, And now that we are confronted first by our loneliness of subjectivity, and second by people with different views and different cultural practices, let's say, what can we do about it? Like we need to find a new way to live that is not in the same line of multiculturalism, because that has been a failure in my opinion, which is to focus on our differences instead of what makes us similar.
Right. I mean, the thing that's very reductive as well, I think, in the narrative of multiculturalism is that it's usually touted out as though focusing on what makes us different rather than similar is an absolute good, right? It's just a good thing. It cannot be bad, actually, right? It can only be good because, hey, we're different, right? That's diversity. But actually, it can be bad, right? Diversity is not always appropriate, right? Diversity in some situations is bad because what you want is coherence, right? And so diversity or lack thereof are not goods in their own right or bads in their own right? They are things that are context appropriate or inappropriate. Now, fact is,
it's all about which level are we which level of context are we talking
exactly
about? I mean, absolutely.
So the fact that people seem to be convinced that yes, we have to speak about diversity as though it is an end in itself, right? But diversity is not useful if you're talking about a military, right? If you're talking about a military that needs to just do a certain thing, right? It needs to be with maximal efficiency done. Then diversity is not necessarily the thing that's going to be getting you there. Now, it might be, right? Maybe I just haven't read the study that just disproves this statement blatantly, but this is an empirical claim, and we have to be open to the possibility that whatever we want to believe, whatever we ideologically may want to believe, may not be true. And unfortunately, people seem so unopen to that. They are just closed to the idea or to the notion that perhaps diversity is not always a good in itself, right? Perhaps diversity and certain types of diversity are not necessarily good, right? Perhaps the best type of diversity in certain situations is the worst type of diversity in other situations. Different types of diversity, such as, diversity in gender, diversity in race, diversity in intellectual points of view, right? These are all different types of diversity. Now, do you want, is diversity in gender the best way for you to get the strongest, rugby team, for example? No, it's just not, right? It's not. Right? Actually, it's liable to be completely destructive of your prospects. Now, this is not this is to court controversy, right? Just saying this is to court massive controversy, but it really should not be, right? That doesn't mean anything. Has no implication on whether we should want to democratize opportunities and allow people to do what they wish to do, so long as it is based on merit, right? If they are able to show the prerequisite skills, then fine, right? There's nothing against that, right? If they are able to show, if we are able to show with certainty or with some reasonable efficacy that a diversity is a good thing in this particular case, which it is, by the way, in many cases, right? So many jobs offer a great opportunity to combine people from different cultures, different backgrounds, different ideas as well, right? That can help elevate the work, right? Help elevate the work by bringing in new ideas, new concepts, new ways of viewing things. And so, but we just need to be really open about what that actually is, and whether it is going to be true in every situation or not. It shouldn't really matter, right? But people are so committed these days to assuming that everything has to be either absolutely good or absolutely bad. It's just strange.
It's dogmatic thinking, I believe. So to bring back the point of substituting your loneliness of subjectivity, or let's seemingly substituting your loneliness of subjectivity, because
attempting to, right?
Attempting, with bad ideas.
Or
so
tribalism,
how do you see that?
Right, as well.
Tribalism, with tribalism, I mean, that is a bad idea.
Yeah. I mean, well, it depends, right? I mean, that's
exactly. So some form of a quest for a collective meaning is necessary for our survival.
Absolutely.
Tribalism
would not exist and persist if it was not evolutionarily useful, right? And if and we would not see the pain of people who are lonely, right? Who are seeking out things like Alcoholics Anonymous groups to help them find meaning, to fix their lives. You wouldn't see
anonymous
these,
groups,
right? For example, right? In general, right? You wouldn't see this if it was not useful, right? If it was wholly destructive, you just would not see it, right? There must be something there, right? That to use the Chesterton's fence concept, right? The Chesterton's fence concept is one that I recently sent you, and I think it's a very useful concept that many people just don't have in mind, especially the more progressive, forward-looking individuals, I think, tend to be blind to this idea. And the idea is this: Chesterton's fence is this concept taken from a story written by a guy called Chesterton, where he suggests that if a person approaches you wishing to take down a fence that is already in order, that is already in place, and they are unable to explain why the fence was there in the first place, then they should not be allowed to remove the fence, right? This is kind of a motivation for grounded reform, for understanding before destruction, or understanding before creation, right? And it is this idea that you cannot be going around destroying things for which you see no evidence of the use of, right? Just because you don't see it doesn't mean there is no use for it, right? Just because you approach a fence and you see it there and you have no idea for what reason it was put, that is not sufficient to justify removing the fence. In fact, Chesterton argues the opposite. Chesterton argues that the only people that should be allowed to remove things or to change things for which there is now seemingly no use are those people who are able to explain why there is no longer a use and what the original use was, right? It is someone who is an aware reformist, someone who is able to study what is and then chart a course to what ought to be, right? Rather than simply knowing what ought to be and charging into that with no conceptualization of what the facts on the ground are. The people who are able to do that, the people who are able to go from is to ought, rather than simply say ought and let's just ignore completely what is.
Well, really, from ought to is.
Well, I mean, either way, right? It's both ways, I guess, in that sense, right? Mm-hmm. But the point is, you have to have a grounding in the facts on the ground before you do away or chart a course to wherever you want to go, right? You want to go somewhere, you have to know where you are, right? You cannot just know where you want to be without knowing where you are. And people are just wanting to destroy things. They want to destroy the institutions like tribalism. All forms of tribalism are bad. No, that's not true, right? There are positive forms of tribalism. And you and I sometimes, because we are so focused on explaining to people that certain forms of tribalism are wrong, and it seems like every form of tribalism on offer today is just a bad way of channeling your anger or your emotions, we seem to be the enemies of tribalism. We're not, right? We understand what it means to be part of a group, right? We have friends. We know what it means, how important it is to feel connected to friends. And
we do understand what it's like not to be part of the grander group. You know, what it's like to have your loneliness of subjectivity be the predominant
feature of your life.
Feature of your life. So, like, absolutely, yes.
Yeah, so I think the issue is that people mistake us for enemies of tribalism. Again, I think the nuance here is lost. It's not simply that tribalism bad. It's not simply that diversity good. No, you have to understand this in a more nuanced and evolutionarily aware point of view, especially when you're talking about deep and long-lived institutions that predate human civilization, right? We're not usually talking about 6,000 years when we're talking about human history. We are talking about 200,000, 300,000 years, perhaps even going to before we were human, right? Because it's not like we came out of nowhere, right? And actually, this is the relevant point that people get angry about. Is that they assume that we are talking about history as in we're talking about 200 years ago, right? We're not talking about history.
Yeah, it's only European colonialist.
Yeah.
Because that's seemingly all the history that has ever
all the history that matters, right? As well, right?
Yeah.
Which is just so pathological. If you cannot speak about the root of tribalism, the root of tribalism was not colonialism, okay? Or the strongest manifestation of tribalism was not colonialism. The strongest manifestation of racism was not necessarily the specific black slave trade, right? It wasn't necessarily that, right? These things have existed in many forms, in some of the worst forms, and they've existed in forever, pretty much, for all intents and purposes, right? And they have deep roots. So just going back,
if I actually may interject
sure.
here, a quote from Nicholas Christakis' book, Blueprint: The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society, comes in mind, especially about us now talking about historical forces and evolutionary ones.
Yeah.
So in the end of his book, here's what he writes. He says, a key danger of viewing historical forces as more salient than evolutionary ones in explaining human society is that our species' stories becomes more fragile. Giving historical forces primacy may even tempt us to give up and feel that a good social order is unnatural. But I argue the good things we see around us are part of what makes us human in the first place. And I furthermore conclude with what I think is a political point even, which is we should be humble in the face of temptations to engineer society in opposition to our instincts. But fortunately, we do not need to exercise any such authority in order to have a good life. And I argue the arc of our evolutionary history is long, but it bends towards goodness.
Yeah. I mean, this is brilliantly put, and it captures exactly the point that we are always at a loss for words to explain to people, especially people of leftist orientation. I mean, I have to stress this because I do not see it from right-wingers as often these days. I do see it from right-wingers in Egypt, right, and Middle Eastern right-wingers, but especially in the West. The problem is people think that, human history consists of 6,000 years, and that what came before could not have had any bearing because it was only at 6,000 years that we became suddenly capable of writing down our history, and therefore just became a completely different species, or didn't even become a species at all. We became these potentially perfect blank slates that were then only corrupted by society. Right now, this might seem a caricature, but there are people who do not explicate this, but act on these assumptions. They seemingly behave as though this is the way they view the world. And it's just important to note that it really isn't true. Right? And Nicholas Christakis' point is really good because it allows us to understand that we really do not need to attempt to pretend like there is no human nature, or that human nature is the opposite of what everything we see in the world indicates it is, right? Or have seen in the world indicates it is, to be able to live a good life. Now, unfortunately, our current circumstance is such that many of our institutions are harnessing the worst in us, right? Capitalist markets are able to harness, for example, our cravings for sugar, right? This is a more apolitical claim, right? People are not going to be denying this on political bases, but we can make this argument fully reasonably, right? The fact that we were designed, or not designed, but kind of evolved to seek out sugar in every instance that it would arise, right, in our environment.
Yeah, to make this point, I think clear to our audiences. So there are two ways to view this, right? The sugar analogy. So one would be, the reason we consume too much sugar is because big corporations have brainwashed and indoctrinated us into loving sugar. And the other way, which I believe is the correct way, is, well, there must be some way in which humans like sugar.
Their job must have been easier for them than that, right? I mean, this is
much
the assumption
easier,
is
right?
basically the opposite because it goes, I don't believe in corporations are that capable of rewiring us from scratch, right? I think their job was actually easier. They were working in line with our impulses rather than against, right?
And to take the same example, it's also this assumption that big corporations have always been big corporations, right? I mean, and I say this analogous to other things. So here's what I mean. Let's take Coca-Cola, for example. Coca-Cola sold, what was it, like 8 bottles its first year? Yeah, the idea that emergence has such power to shift our biology that much, in any sense, the way sugar or any other political points you'd like to make, is that we tend to not look that there must be some part of our nature that is already pre-wired or manipulated to like what we like, or to consume as much as we are consuming.
Right. Now, I think the issue is that they ignore the environment of evolutionary adaptation in favor of the environment of evolutionary novelty, right? And I think we might want to define those two just to make sure that people are aware. And these are concepts proposed by...
Please elaborate on that.
Yeah, these are concepts proposed by evolutionary biologists Heather Heying and Bret Weinstein, to give credit where it's due, and they really sharpen up your thinking once you bring them into full view. The idea is the following. The environment of evolutionary adaptation is this pseudo-mythical kind of story that we tell ourselves about how the environment that we existed in prehistorically looked like, right? The original environment in which human faculties, human capacities were essentially tuned up so as to function pretty much the same way until today. So the environment of evolutionary adaptation is essentially the environment that we came up in, right? That we emerged in. And it is the environment that we were originally adapted to. Now, this is something that most people are not really consciously and finely in touch with, but in general, you are not evolved for your environment. An organism is not evolved for their environment, is not adapted to their environment. They are adapted to the environment of their ancestors, who are adapted to the environment of their ancestors. And we keep going back, basically to realize that there are instances where there is such a mismatch, or there have been instances where there was such a mismatch between the environment to which an individual was adapted, the environment of their ancestors, and the environment that they ended up in, such that that individual died as a result, right? So it is very possible that you might find yourself as an organism in an environment that is so dissimilar to the environment to which all your faculties, all your tools, all your capacities are adapted, such that you have no way to survive. And the issue there is that in some cases, it doesn't mean you will die. In some cases, it just means that all these tools become very badly calibrated, right? Your new environment simply has such different demands that your tools come apart, right? And essentially, I think one of the things that people miss out is that today humans are essentially functioning especially today, are functioning in a world so different from the world to which they were originally adapted. And this is not necessarily to say that it is a better or a worse world, right? Just objectively, it is so different. And what it inevitably is different for our tools and our capacities, right? The fact that we are so attuned to face-to-face interaction, the fact that we are evolved for face-to-face interaction and not evolved for long calls and texting, makes the ability to keep in touch through mere texting so difficult, right? And yet we are able to pick it up very young, very quickly, and that's partially because the companies do such a good job of developing products that we will precisely be interested in, that harness our evolutionary tendencies and habits. But these tools are so novel that we are caused really to be in disarray, right? Our entire way of viewing the world, our entire perception of it, it's changed by the fact that we have to interface so differently, right? I mean, when I'm talking to Youssef, I'm not looking at his face at the moment, right? We are on a call. And this has enormous impacts on the degree to which he and I can navigate each other's emotions or each other's views. And it certainly has impacts on our ability to have a conversation. Right? Now, luckily, Youssef and I are in the position to have had many conversations before and to be very able to pick up on each other's cues, verbally, tone-wise. But I mean, think about even through text, it becomes difficult at times. And with others, right, who we don't know so well, I mean, this is so apparent to me, especially on Facebook, where I often am just publishing my views and putting them out there. And, you know, I'm all too sure to receive backlash because it seems like all my friends are terrible people, right? who want to attack me as soon as I post. No, I'm very grateful for that. But it's sad because I see friends who I am very able to have a conversation with face to face, and I'm not saying that this is their fault. Sometimes it's mine. A lot of times it's mine. But I see our conversations break down. And this is just, it's a function of the environment of evolutionary novelty and the fact that we have to recalibrate to these very new things that we are engaging with, right? That are very different, that take us out of our world, really, that the world we were in historically.
Yeah, so to bring some synthesis to all this, you know,
yeah,
in relation to the loneliness of subjectivity, and substituting our loneliness for, now that our loneliness is much more apparent given the fragilization of past well-working tribalist institutions or
functional
or practices, functional ones. So here's to bring some synthesis in what you just said, to just synthesize and bring it all together. So our claim, our proposition, me and Ahmed's proposition, is not to move into this radical view of individuality in which we shouldn't find some common denominator between all of us, right? It's not that. It's rather that
on the contrary.
On the contrary, it's that we should harness our evolutionary knowledge, our historic knowledge, and sit down and find a way in which, moving forward, we can utilize what we know, and by the understanding of our human nature, construct a new worldview that works not only for the generations now, but for our children and for people to come. Something that is...
But not just that it works, also that
it's true.
And this is something that it'll have over past narratives, right? The point is, we need to construct a narrative that is both true, but also captures the mythological narrativization that we are so attuned to, so in love with, that keeps us sane.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. So we should come up with a process, rather, that is true, right? A process that includes within itself the instruments to change when things get too hard and rigid and it cannot adapt to environments to come. So Ahmed and I's proposition is we need to sit down and we need to think about what is the next step. We're in a very unique and honestly lucky part of history that we are observing such a change that I wouldn't say my father had to deal with, or my grandfather to say. Because they were really in the emergence of the 20th century, in which things were not really as fragile and they were still changing. And now that we have reached this point, this meltdown, and you can see it, in Europe, it's this, like with the riots, with the protests, with things that are happening. And we need to sit down and take into account that there is no way that your race, gender, ethnicity plays such a fundamental role that it might relieve you of your own loneliness of subjectivity.
And there is no way that, sorry to cut you off, there is no way that just because someone has a similar race, ethnicity, whatever you have, does not mean that they are going to understand you any better than a person who is different on these dimensions but shares so many other dimensions. I mean, something that people miss out is that when you mention ethnicity, gender, those are two identities of how many? I mean, you can point to a person and label them as all kinds of things, and you would still not be done with everything that comes to capture their experience. And just the fact that we come from the same environment does not relieve you of your loneliness. What does relieve you, however, and maybe this is something that you were coming to, Youssef, what does relieve you of that issue is, to some degree, it doesn't completely relieve you, but it relieves you to some degree, right? That someone can potentially understand you. What does relieve you is friendship, is camaraderie, is finding people who understand you as an individual and who are individuals. People who you find you share assumptive layers, to use another term that Youssef and I usually throw around. The concept of assumptive layers is probably obvious to whoever hears the term, but just to kind of put a fine point on it, or a fine line under it, essentially what the concept of assumptive layers is this idea that your perception, your entire view of the world, and this is stretching back to Kant and stretching back to the idea that we are essentially evolved creatures. It is the idea that your perception, the way you construct the world, the way you come to experience it, is layered. And it is layered in the sense that there are many things, even subconsciously, that are coming to bring forth this perception that you happen to have. And those things include things like genetics. They include things like your particular environment, the shared and unshared environment, right, so to speak. It includes things of the type that Youssef mentioned, right? So how you happened to meet your first girlfriend, how you got your heart broken, right? How you used to play with your best friends when you were children, right? Or these kinds of things, what your first job was like. It is to find people who have these similar experiences and who perhaps even have similar ways that they have dealt with these experiences on the basis of your individuality. It is not on the basis of the fact that you are both members to certain groups. It is that you both as individuals experienced certain events. And the distinction here is subtle, but it does exist. To look for someone who is like you individually rather than like you on one dimension is to find someone who is far more attuned to your actual experience. And by the way, you might find that that person does not share your race, does not share your gender, right?
And even if they do, right? I mean, even if they do, let's say there's some truism to the fact that, well, two black Americans, for example, or two white Americans will have a common assumptive layer.
Yeah.
Okay, let's say that it's not to give primacy to that assumptive layer. That's the entire proposition. It's to understand that the intersectionality of all your assumptive layers are what makes you an individual, not a single one. Right. Not to give primacy to any of the group use of the infinite groups you're part of.
Yeah, group membership is essential, but it is only essential because you are an individual who needs it. Right? Group membership is not essential because you will become the group or you are simply identifying with the average of whatever group you are part of. No, it is because of what you can bring to that group as an individual and what that group can bring you as an individual. And the idea that it is only a person who is sharing one of your assumptive layers that is going to be able to understand you rather than several of your assumptive layers, right? This idea is just wrong. I mean, you can find similarities and shared assumptive layers in the most seemingly precarious places, right? You can find them with people who you do not expect to share any experiences with or to have shared any experiences with. And you may have not shared any experiences with personally, but you might meet someone who you've just met a year ago and realize that you have more in common, you're able to click more, you're able to have more chemistry in general than any other individual that you've met and spent, 3 years, 4 years talking to. And these things happen, right? Now, again, time matters, and the time you spend with someone is going to intensify whatever your relationship or level of understanding is. And partially, even if you start off not being fully on the same page, it is through time together and experiences shared and through dialogue, and dialogue is important here, that you can come to understand each other, really understand each other as best as we can. Not fully, not perfectly, not in any way that might relieve the loneliness of subjectivity. Absolutely. But who wants that anyway, right? To relieve the loneliness of subjectivity permanently would be to remove you of your individuality, to take it away from you. That's not something you want. What you want is to be not absolutely lonely, at least. To have people who do understand you to some degree. But not to remove your individuality. Your individuality is what makes you you, right? And be corny about it, right?
It's you need to identify with yourself, with that exists across time and does not really change. And it's and to bring this episode to a conclusion, really. I would like to reflect on my friendship with Ahmed. And the reason we tend to bring up the idea of assumptive layers a lot and the loneliness of subjectivity would be that, well, Ahmed and I share a lot of those, right? We really understand each other. And when I mean understand each other, I find these quotes on Facebook, these just girly things quotes. And one of them always catches my eye, right? Which is find someone that you don't have to translate your soul to.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
and I think that's very relatable to people, when you have to speak to someone and you're trying to, let's say you're in a state in which your linguistic faculties are not really helping you to precisely deliver your point through. Not that they can ever precisely.
We know those states well.
Yeah, we do. And to have someone share your worldview, to have someone have their layers really to a great extent built in a way that have them perceive exactly what you're saying in the way you want them to perceive it and in the way you want to deliver your message through is something that, even if for a moment, relieves you of your loneliness of subjectivity. And I do believe that we do need that, right? We do need moments in which we de-individualize.
It's so meaningful.
In which we are part of something that is bigger.
Right.
And that is not to say that you cannot communicate with people that do not share very similar assumptive layers. In fact, the reason you keep learning and reading and listening to podcasts, let's say, is to, first of all, gain new assumptive layers and expand on the ones you already have.
Yeah.
So that's why we should not, and if you can elaborate on this, Ahmed, just let me. We should not substitute our loneliness of subjectivity with ideas that are bad, with groupthink, with reducible assumptive layers, which you can only believe in one assumptive layer and give a primacy over all others. Because that's really what makes us human, right? It's the ability to sit with someone that has come from a very different background. You know, that maybe that, you know, their grandfathers were aristocrats, you know, feudal aristocrats, and your grandfather was a serf, and you can sit together right now and find common assumptive layers, and talk about and find this human connection. And that's really what makes us human. That's really what's so beautiful about conversation. It's our only tool. It's our only tool to break through our assumptive layers, and that's why I always urge my friends when they're having a bad time not to raise their hands and go, why is this happening to me? No one can ever understand me. Well, if you declare that no one can ever understand you, then no one will ever understand you. I do understand that on some level that is true. It's true on some level, right? I mean, sure, no one can understand you, but you should try to make people understand you. You should read, you should converse. I mean, these are all things that we evolved precisely to do things like that, precisely to fill in the gaps between unshared experiences.
Yeah, and do you want me to come in here now?
Yeah, come in here.
Yeah, so, and basically I wanted to just say, I mean, we're constantly surprised by where we happen to find shared assumptive layers, and that's part of the beauty of friendship, is you realize there are things that are operating in the deepest recesses of your mind, possibly historically throughout your life, that have probably made it so that you and this person who you just happen to have met were kind of put on a trajectory to be able to communicate with each other at a deeper level, more simply than you would with a person who doesn't share the same assumptive layers. Now, the fact that Youssef said that you can't necessarily communicate with someone, that you can communicate with someone who has different assumptive layers. I mean, just to add on to that, it isn't that it's impossible to communicate with someone who has different assumptive layers. It's that it just takes a bit more. Because if your assumptive layers are so different, then you have to start from the ground up, right? Whereas it is as if you are kind of trying to stand somewhere on a hill so as to position yourself at an appropriate level to be able to go up from there and to reach a deeper level or a higher level of conversation. And if you guys share nothing, you are basically at the very bottom of that hill, right? Basically, all you share at that moment is all the assumptive layers built into you by evolution, right? But biologically, but none that are built in culturally. I mean, none that are built in linguistically. I mean, language is a common assumptive layer. The fact that you are able to understand English changes your brain in a grammatical structure.
And if you can touch, Ahmed, on the idea that when all assumptive layers fail, we have other processes we should really deploy there, right?
Yeah.
So if you can touch on that, please.
Right. So, I mean, I think what you're talking about here is that sometimes you are unable to communicate with someone at a certain level. So perhaps you're disagreeing with someone on the issue of abortion. And maybe in this case, the actual argument you should be having isn't actually about abortion itself, right? It isn't actually about whether abortion is morally right or not. It is about definitions. And in that situation, you need to go down a layer. You need to go down a layer and discuss what assumptions are being brought into. When do you believe this fetus becomes conscious? Is it consciousness that you're interested in? Is it life in itself? What exactly are you using to define whether something is right or wrong? What is the criterion? And what's very useful in these instances is to go down a set of is to go down certain assumptive layers, to go down a level or two or three or however many is required. And obviously, you'll need more time the more levels are not shared, right? And try to steel man each other, right? Try to really figure out what the other person is attempting to say and put it in the brightest, starkest terms, and the terms that will basically make the other person go, oh, wow, I wish I would have put it that way, right? And this is exactly what you are going to need if you're going to go up with that person from no assumptive layers up until, okay, we have enough shared now, even if we don't agree on every tidbit, so as to have a deeper, higher level conversation. And definitely avoid character attacks. This is another thing, right? Character attacks are probably the worst thing you can do in an argument if what you're disagreeing about is of substance. Right? You just automatically ruin the conversation. You derail it and you make it such that there's just no way of getting back from that, right? If your attack on a person is personal rather than substantive, that's brought a whole different dimension. It's brought ego, it's brought all kinds of different demons that humans tend to be carrying around as they walk around into the conversation, and probably the conversation is not going to recover, not because the conversation is not solvable. It's not because you cannot actually agree with that person on anything ever. It's because once you bring in bad faith, to quote Bret Weinstein again, bad faith changes everything, right? Once you bring in an attack on a person's character, you've ruined what any prospect for diving deep down with that person to the recesses of that person's mind and figuring out, okay, what does this person actually believe deeply? What is making this person operate like this at the higher levels? What is down there that's making you operate this way? No one's going to let you in. No one's going to let you in that deep if you're attacking their character straight away. No way. It's impossible.
Everything you've just mentioned happened to be the political and social role of the left, or should have been the political and social role of the left. Mercy. Asking the questions of why are people saying what they're saying, and it seems to have shifted. It seems that the current left has so much more in common with the past right that I just wanted to add that because I do believe that we should have mercy, right?
Yeah.
It's really easy to jump to conclusion that someone is racist or homophobe or it's so easy. What's more difficult really is which is really the message of non-violence, which is to take it upon yourself to be merciful and to sit down and first of all maybe self-reflect, but also if you have done enough self-reflection that you believe that your argument is substantially correct, to have the mercy to understand that the person in front of you must not necessarily have any bad faith in what they believe, and maybe they're just misguided, and maybe they can change their opinion to the better.
And that it takes time for them to chart a course from where they are to perhaps where you are,
we have no
or the
mercy.
opposite.
We have no mercy anymore, and it really it's really painful. It's really painful because growing in a society like ours, you could not afford not to have mercy, right? Because if you did not have mercy,
merciful.
Yeah, if I did not have mercy in Egypt, I would have no friends. I would have no one to talk to,
right?
Because it's
everyone disagrees
common.
with you.
Yeah, I mean, almost everyone.
Like, there's not a person I've met that agree. No,
Yeah,
I'm joking.
almost, yeah, almost everyone. Almost, really, almost.
Yeah,
everyone
it is
disagrees.
true.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, just a call a few people to be more merciful, to understand that you have a lot to work on yourself, but you also have a lot to do when you feel that someone else is misguided. And I think a push away from that has been really the what's going on right now, and I really don't like it.
Yeah,
just on some emotional level, it really irks me and it pisses me off.
Yeah, I mean, just to go back, because I wanted to bring back the Tumblr quote. You don't have to explain your soul. I never expected to find the deepest gem within those deep, dark abysses, but yeah, I mean, it's exactly that, because you do not want someone, I mean, especially if you're looking for someone as a friend or a partner, or someone you're going to be engaged with long term and iteratively, you do not want to have to rehash the very foundations of who you are, of how you view the world, of what is true, every time you have a conversation. Now, ideally, you should be able to go there if need be with that person. You should be, absolutely. If the person is someone you're going to be engaging with all the time, you should be able to visit, when needed, the deepest and most basic fundamentals of what you believe, because maybe you're both wrong. Right? That's something that Youssef and I are always concerned about, right? We've become we are so similar that we are serving as an echo chamber where there should not be that. And so we are constantly revisiting covered ground. Not because I need to explain it to Youssef, I don't, but because we need to figure out if it's actually true, if it's actually accurate. And I have several friends who I've had the benefit of meeting and benefit of making that I can do this with. And really, it is friendship between individuals, not that is a function of your belonging to a pure group, that in the end will get you the richest convergence of assumptive layers. Because you can find someone who is a friend of yours because you share one dimension, but by going to a group that you both are a part of. But it's not the same as sharing an actual time with individuals. And I'm glad to say that a lot of my friends are individuals, and they're disagreeing with me constantly, right? Not all of them are as agreeable with me as Youssef is, and even Youssef, he's just hiding it, but he can really he can really make me angry sometimes, and it's fine, it's good, it's healthy. You need to keep that. So yeah, I think I have nothing really more to say on that topic, and I'm very grateful to everyone for listening. But that's essentially what I wanted to say. Do you want to end it on the Tumblr quote?
And
or do you want to add something?
Just as my final notes,
okay,
before we end this, is I mean, you owe it to yourself to get over your loneliness of subjectivity. You owe it to yourself to try to make it better. Don't live a life thinking that no one will ever understand you, and just try. I'm not saying it's a positive scenario in which it's always going to work, but without trying, it's just so lonely. It's so Kafkaesque. It's just, I mean, Franz Kafka is my favorite author, and that's really where I relate to. Almost, it's paradoxical, because our assumptive layer, or I feel my assumptive layer with Franz Kafka, is how much we dwell on our loneliness of subjectivity. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say. Just I hope everyone takes care, and that's it. Yeah, and keep it together, guys, in these difficult times. Hopefully things are getting a bit better in some places. I know other places it's not looking like it's gonna be much better in a while, but yeah, stay safe, and we're sending love. Right. Bye. Bye-bye.